The sun was bright over the port of Miami on the morning of the 8th of June, 1985, as passengers lined up to board the MS Pacific Sky, a mid-sized cruise liner scheduled for a week-long trip through the Caribbean. Among the hundreds of excited travelers were Eleanor and Michael Rowe, newlyweds from Asheville, North Carolina, both 28 years old. They had married just 3 days earlier in a small backyard ceremony and were glowing with anticipation. The cruise had been a surprise wedding gift from Eleanor's parents, and all-inclusive honeymoon through Nassau, St. Thomas, and the Dominican Republic. Michael, a high school biology teacher, was reserved, methodical, and quietly observant. Eleanor, on the other hand, was outgoing, artistic, and had a habit of documenting every experience with her vintage Minolta camera, which she wore across her chest like a badge of honor. The couple had dated since college, and by all accounts, they were inseparable. They were assigned cabin 422B, located on the starboard side of the lower deck, modest but comfortable. The cruise set sail at 4:45 p.m., and by nightfall, the ship was miles off the Florida coast, cutting through calm waters. Over the next 2 days, several passengers recalled seeing the Rose frequently, laughing during the evening entertainment shows, dancing on the open deck under string lights, sipping cocktails at the Horizon Lounge. Eleanor was particularly friendly, known for starting conversations and snapping candid photos of strangers, which she promised to mail after the trip. On the third night, the 10th of June, they were seen dining alone at the Coral Reef restaurant, dressed elegantly for the formal dinner night. It would be the last confirmed sighting of the couple. By the morning of the 11th of June, the atmosphere aboard the ship had subtly shifted. A steward named Carlos Mendez, who was in charge of cleaning the cabins on Deck 4, reported that cabin 422B had not been accessed since the previous evening. The bed appeared unused, and both luggage bags remained open, half unpacked. Eleanor's camera was missing. Michael's watch, which he reportedly never removed, was left on the nightstand. At first, the crew assumed the couple had simply overslept or gone on an early shore excursion. But when they failed to check in during the ship's arrival at Nassau later that day, and their names did not appear on any excursion logs, suspicions grew. At 6:30 p.m., the ship's captain, Raymond Holtz, was notified. He ordered a full search of the vessel, including all public areas, restricted sections, and even the engine room. No trace of Eleanor or Michael was found. The following day, the ship docked in San Juan, Puerto Rico. There, the local Coast Guard and U.S. consulate were alerted. A formal missing persons report was filed. The remaining itinerary was cut short, and the vessel returned to Miami with investigators already on board, interviewing passengers and collecting statements. But no one had seen the Rose after the 10th of June. There was no signs of struggle, no complaints of noise or disturbance from neighboring cabins, no entries on their onboard expense accounts. It was as if they had simply vanished. The FBI opened a joint investigation with U.S. maritime authorities, suspecting foul play, but also considering the possibility of an accident, such as falling overboard. Still, something didn't sit right with lead investigators. Special Agent Dana Whitmore, who was assigned to the case in July 1985. There was no high wind, no rough sea that night. The decks were dry, no reports of storms. She would later state in a 1997 interview, "Couples don't just vanish mid-cruise without leaving a single clue, especially not ones like the Rose." Family and friends were interviewed. According to Eleanor's sister, the newlyweds were deeply in love with no history of instability or conflict. Michael's co-workers described him as responsible and grounded. There was no indication of financial trouble and no large insurance policies involved. The ship's security logs were reviewed extensively. No alarms were triggered. No unusual card activity. Cabin 422B's door had last been accessed with a card key at 11:14 p.m. on the 10th of June, presumed to be the couple returning from dinner. That was it. A few photos were developed from a roll of film Eleanor had dropped off at the ship's photo kiosk on the 9th of June. They showed smiling passengers, a sunset over open water, and one particularly striking shot of Michael alone looking out at the horizon. But the final roll, the one still inside Eleanor's missing camera, was never recovered. By early 1986, with no new leads and no physical evidence, the case of Michael and Eleanor Rose faded from headlines and was quietly archived under unresolved maritime disappearances. The families, devastated, tried for years to keep the investigation alive. Eleanor's mother, Judith Pearson, mailed letters to senators, travel agencies, and cruise line executives, begging for renewed efforts. Michael's younger brother, Thomas Rowe, even flew to Nassau and Puerto Plata on his own dime, speaking to local fishermen and dock workers. No one had seen anything. No one remembered the names. In 1988, 3 years after the disappearance, the cruise company Eastern Caribbean Voyages Limited sold the MS Pacific Sky to another line and rebranded it. Cabin 422B was reportedly remodeled and renumbered. By 1990, the Rose names were largely forgotten outside of North Carolina. The case became one of many in a growing list of cruise disappearances that year. There were no signs of fraud, no ransom demands, no bodies, just silence. Until nearly 12 years later, something would finally shift. It was May 16, 1997, on the southern coast of the Dominican Republic, near the small and rarely visited fishing village of Las Roas, a forgotten cove battered by tides and known mainly to locals. That morning, a fisherman named Luis Enriquez, 54, was walking along the shoreline after a night storm had churned the bay. The waves had left a trail of debris, broken branches, seaweed, plastic fragments. But among them, something caught his attention. It was a badly eroded seaweed-covered duffel bag wedged beneath a cluster of volcanic rocks. Luis pulled it loose. The zipper was rusted shut, but the bag was surprisingly intact. He brought it back to the village and with the help of a neighbor managed to force it open. Inside were 2 deteriorated passports, both issued in the US, a woman's compact camera, a water-damaged notebook, and a collection of soaked personal items, postcards, a small jewelry box, and fragments of fabric. The pages of the notebook were smeared, mostly unreadable, but the camera, though weathered, still held a 35mm film roll sealed in its metal casing. Louise took the passports to the local police in the town of Verona, where the names were immediately flagged by an international database. Michael Rowe and Eleanor Rowe, missing since 1985. News of the discovery reached the U.S. Embassy in Sto Domingo within 48 hours. The items were secured and flown to Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. The most urgent task developing the film inside Eleanor's camera, the one that had never been found. It took several attempts. The film had absorbed years of moisture and suffered from exposure. But miraculously, 6 frames were salvageable. Grainy, color-washed, damaged at the edges, but visible. Among them, a photo of Eleanor smiling beside a lifeboat wearing a red sundress, a blurry image of the moonlit ocean taken from the deck, a photo of Michael at dinner raising a glass of wine, a curious shot of a man in a white uniform, not a known crew member, standing beside a storage hatch on the outer deck. The man's face was partly obscured by glare. And the final 2 photos, a self-timed shot of both Eleanor and Michael smiling nervously, taken near what appeared to be a lower utility corridor, not accessible to passengers. And the final image, partially obscured by darkness, showed what seemed to be an open hatch, with the ocean far below and a handrail bent at an odd angle. The FBI reopened the case immediately. When the FBI officially reopened the Rowe case in June of 1997, nearly 12 years after the couple vanished, it was assigned to Special Agent Lauren Keats, a 14-year veteran with a background in maritime cases. She was given access to the original investigative files, the recently recovered items from the Dominican Republic, and the newly developed photographs. Keats began by revisiting the passenger manifest from the MS Pacific Sky's 1,985 cruise. Over 600 passengers and 118 crew members had been on board, but only a fraction had ever been thoroughly questioned. The file contained statements from about 30 people, mostly cabin neighbors, restaurant staff, and the ship's entertainment crew. But now, with the new photographs in hand, especially the one showing a man in a white uniform near the off-limits hatch, Keats began to zero in. With the help of digital enhancement teams at Quantico, the grainy photo was cleaned up just enough to distinguish a few key features. The man appeared to be wearing a crew uniform, but not one that matched the MS Pacific Sky's official records. He had a distinctive scar over his left eyebrow. On the edge of the photo, partially visible, was a cart with cleaning supplies, an older model of equipment used by maintenance workers. Cross-referencing this image with employment logs from 1985 proved challenging. The cruise line had gone through a merger in 1989, and many personnel records were incomplete or lost, but Agent Keats managed to obtain a partial list of maintenance subcontractors hired for that particular voyage. One name stood out: Edard F. Morales, a 3-4-year-old Panamanian national, had been listed as a contracted cleaner for 3 months during that summer. There was no U.S. criminal record on file, but Interpol flagged a sealed report linking him to a violent incident aboard a commercial ferry in 1983 involving a missing passenger. Morales had disappeared from the system in 1987. No tax records, no border crossings, no work visa renewals. Agent Keats began contacting surviving crew members from the cruise. Many had long since retired, but a few responded. One of them was Antonio "Tony" Dloa, who had been a bartender on the ship's upper deck bar in 1985. When shown the enhanced photo of the man near the hatch, Tony's reaction was immediate. "Yeah, I remember that guy. We called him El Sensio. Never talked. Always mopping around the restricted decks at night. Gave me the creeps." Another former crew member, Maria Estrella, who had worked housekeeping on Deck 4, recalled hearing a woman scream faintly on the night of the 10th of June. But when she reported it to security, she was told it was probably just a drunk passenger and sent back to her duties. Both testimonies had never been recorded in the original 1985 file. Keats then turned to the photo, showing the open hatch and the bent handrail. Using diagrams of the ship's original structure, secured through maritime archives, she determined that the photo had likely been taken near the starboard maintenance corridor, close to the emergency vent access, a narrow gated area used only by technical staff. This area was not under surveillance, and access was supposed to be locked, but maintenance staff had override keys. If the Rose had gone there willingly or otherwise, it was possible they were coerced, or that one of them had been led there under false pretenses, with the other following. There were now enough pieces on the board to begin formulating a theory. But what had happened after that photo was taken? And why was Eleanor's bag only discovered 12 years later, hundreds of miles away? To understand how Eleanor's duffel bag ended up on a beach near Las Roas, Dominican Republic, over 400 nautical miles from the cruise route, Agent Lauren Keats consulted with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and a specialist in ocean drift modeling, Dr. Miguel Anaya. Dr. Anaya used historical weather data and satellite records to reconstruct probable drift patterns in the Caribbean between 1985 and 1997. What he uncovered was compelling. According to the models, if the bag had been tossed overboard or washed out through a hatch or drainage system near the eastern coast of the Dominican Republic, prevailing currents could have swept it in a slow, clockwise loop, part of the North Equatorial Current. Over years, it would have passed near Puerto Rico, drifted east toward open waters, then west again toward the southern coast of the island, especially if caught in seasonal eddies or hurricane-driven currents. The bag, according to Dr. Anaya, could have been adrift for years, periodically caught and released by tides until it finally ran aground after a seasonal storm in 1997. "This isn't unusual," he told Keats. "Objects thrown into the Caribbean can vanish for years, then reappear hundreds of miles away. But this bag, it was preserved too well. It may have been trapped, wedged under reef structures, and only recently dislodged." This opened a chilling possibility. The Rose's bodies or further evidence could still be somewhere underwater, sealed or lost in ship, access points never thoroughly searched. Among the water-damaged items found in the duffel bag, there was a notebook, once a travel journal handwritten by Eleanor. Most of its pages had been erased by salt water, but one partial sentence had been recovered using a forensic ink enhancement technique at Quantico. The words read, quote, "He said we shouldn't be here, not safe. Mike thinks he's lying." End quote. It was impossible to verify the date or the exact context, but the implication was strong that someone, possibly a crew member, had led them to a restricted area, and Eleanor feared something was wrong. The entry supported the theory that they were either tricked or threatened, not simply lost or intoxicated. For Keats, This confirmed that what happened was intentional and likely involved more than one person. In late August 1997, a call came in from a man living in Cologne, Panama. He refused to give his full name at first, but claimed to have served on a Caribbean cruise ship in the Mighty Second and recognized the photo of the man circulated in newspapers, the one with the scar over the eyebrow. "That's Morales," the man said. "We all knew he was trouble." He identified himself only as Raul and agreed to speak with the FBI in San Jose, Costa Rica, where he had since relocated under a different name. Raul revealed that Morales had once been caught forcibly entering a passenger's cabin in 1984, but the incident had been quietly covered up by the cruise line to avoid scandal. Rather than fire him officially, they terminated his contract early and removed his name from the permanent crew logs. The Rose cruise in 1985 was one of his final assignments. Raul also added that Morales was rumored to have access to a private keyring, allowing him into secured hatches and maintenance corridors. These keys were meant only for senior engineering staff, yet no one had ever investigated how Morales got them. He had something on someone. Blackmail maybe, I don't know, but he walked places no cleaner ever should have. With the mounting evidence pointing toward foul play involving restricted areas of the ship, Agent Keats submitted a formal request to the U.S. Maritime Recovery Commission for a targeted underwater search. The MS Pacific Sky, renamed and now sailing under a different flag, had been retrofitted and rebranded in the 1992nd, but records of its original 1985 design were preserved by the Lloyd's Register of Shipping in London. These records included detailed maps of maintenance corridors, build spaces, and auxiliary drain routes, some of which had never been inspected. One structure in particular drew Keats' attention, a sealed utility shaft located beneath the starboard deck, adjacent to the corridor seen in Eleanor's final photo. The shaft led to a discharge port used to release treated grey water into the sea. If tampered with, it could allow an object or even a person to be forced out silently into open water. A partnership was formed with a private salvage company operating near Grand Turk, where the ship had passed during its 1985 voyage. Using side-scan sonar and submersible drones, they began scanning areas where the ship had reportedly slowed down or drifted based on archived navigational data. After 3 weeks of combing the seafloor, on the 14th of September 1997, the team located something unusual. Resting on the seabed 213 foot deep, they found the metal frame of a cruise line utility locker, the kind used in engineering decks. Its hinges were broken, door missing, but one side still bore traces of faded paint, property of Eastern Caribbean Voyages Limited. Inside were several deteriorated items, coiled cable, rusted maintenance tools, and one object that had remained sealed inside a plastic vacuum pouch, likely for protection from humidity. When brought to the surface and carefully opened, it revealed a crew access card with the name E.F. Morales. The implications were staggering. Morales had disappeared from the records in 1987, but here was his card dumped at sea in the same region the ship had crossed shortly after the Rose were last seen. It was clear someone had tried to erase a connection. Whether Morales had fled, been silenced, or disappeared voluntarily was still unknown, but the timeline placed him at the center of the couple's last known moments. The next objective became clear: find the bodies. Agent Keats coordinated with the U.S. Navy's Underwater Forensics Division, who agreed to extend the search radius based on tidal models. The seafloor was rough, filled with coral shelves and sunken debris, but if the Rose had been disposed of through the utility shaft, there was a chance. Something, bones, clothing, fibers, personal items could have been caught in the trenches below. On the 9th of October, 1997, a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, captured footage of a pair of white sneakers partially buried in silt near a rock ledge. Just inches away was the corroded frame of a camera lens matching the model Eleanor had carried. DNA testing later confirmed that the lace fibers matched shoes Eleanor was wearing in one of the photos, but no bodies were recovered. It was likely that the ocean had claimed them long ago, dispersed, buried, or carried off by tides. Still, this discovery was the closest thing to closure the families had received in over a decade. Morales was never located, Despite issuing a red notice through Interpol, no activity surfaced under his name. Theories ranged from suicide to identity change to accomplish protection. In 1999, a maritime commission ruled the Roe case as presumed homicide by unknown individuals, and the cruise line was quietly pressured into a confidential financial settlement with both families without admitting liability. The photos recovered from the bag remain sealed in the FBI archives, except one, the final image of Eleanor and Michael in the corridor, smiling nervously, still clutching each other. It now sits in a frame on Eleanor's mother's mantelpiece, next to 2 candles she lights every the 10th of June. They never got their honeymoon, she once told a reporter, but at least they didn't disappear forever.